Today, 14th May, we get more news of further Russian advances in Kharkiv region. It's becoming increasingly difficult for me to keep up with events, but suffice to say that there's reports of still more villages falling under Russian control in Kharkiv region, of the Russians gaining more ground in Vovchansk. According to some reports, they now control a third of the town, and it seems that they might even have crossed the river that bisects the town, and that they're closing in on Vovchansk from two directions. In one case, from the west through the village of Staritsa, which they have apparently largely occupied, but also from the east through a string of other villages, which, it must be said, from a map, look to me slightly further away from Vovchansk than Staritsa is. And there's also reports of further Russian advances closer to Lipsy, and that the Russians have now actually entered the town of Lipsy and are in the process of storming it. Also, there are reports that the Russians have broadened their bridgehead into Ukraine, if that's the right word, the area that they control in Kharkiv region. Originally, there were two entirely distinct sectors, one around Lipsy, one around Vovchansk. The Russians have now linked the two together so that there is now a continuous line of forces linking all of this territory in one block. And there are more reports that the Russians are now carrying out aggressive shelling and missile and drone strikes further west around the town of Sumy, and that they are preparing another advance into Kharkiv region close to the city of Sumy, which, by the way, they briefly completely occupied in February 2022. Russian troops on their way to Kiev marched through Sumy. There was no resistance from the Ukrainians at that time. Sumy fell entirely under Russian control, but instead of the Russians staying there and consolidating their control of Sumy, they advanced on to Kiev. This has been, ever since, by the way, a topic of some recrimination on the part of various Russian commentators. They feel that it would have made more sense for the Russians to consolidate control of Sumy rather than move on towards Kiev. Well, I'm not going to revisit those old discussions. But anyway, there's reports that the Russians are in the process of, or are on the brink of, starting a new offensive in the Sumy area. Now, there's now been a cascade of increasingly pessimistic reports about the whole situation in Kharkiv in the Western media. The New York Times has now run two separate stories. It says that the Russian advance into Kharkiv is causing massive problems for the Ukrainians, which is true. It says that around 2,000 Russian troops are involved. There are another 55,000 located just beyond the border. Now, I'm going to make a quick observation there. If 2,000 troops in Kharkiv region, Russian troops in Kharkiv region, is all it takes to create the kind of operational crisis for Ukraine that we are seeing, then Ukraine's situation is very critical indeed. As it happens, I think that the New York Times is understating the facts. I think that there are now significantly more than just 2,000 men in Kharkiv region. That might have been the advanced force that crossed into Kharkiv region 5 days ago. The spearhead force, but from what I understand, from what I can work out, there's perhaps 5 to 10,000 Russian troops now occupying, involved in this offensive in Kharkiv region, in the area of Lipsy, and in the area of Kharkiv. And, well, certainly there are tens of thousands more located immediately across the border. And of course, if the Russians do advance into Sumy, close to the city of Sumy, then Ukraine's crisis is going to become deeper still. Now, it's not just in the New York Times that there are alarm bells ringing about the situation. There is comments from none other than Budanov, straightforwardly admitting what is absolutely obvious to anybody who looks at the situation, which is that Ukraine has no reserves left. This is why it is obliged to reassign troops from other parts of the front line to try to plug holes wherever they appear. And we have comments from Budanov to the New York Times, in which he says all of our forces are either here, he means in Kharkiv, or in Chasov Yar. We've used everything we have. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone else in the reserves. This is what aggressive attrition conducted by the Russians over the last 2 years has achieved. It has drained away Ukraine's reserves, but it is also what the extraordinary policy Ukraine has followed of defending every millimeter of ground, of launching fruitless offensives, has also done. And it is also what Western policy has done by pushing Ukraine last year into launching its disastrous summer offensive, which has lost Ukraine all the equipment that the West supplied in the winter and spring of 2022-2023, and also caused it to suffer enormous casualties, from which, as Budanov is now telling us, they have no real replacements for. Budanov, by the way, went on to say that the coming days would be important, and he thinks that Kiev can shore up the defense lines, but he does worry that the Russians are indeed about to launch a new attack further north in Sumy region. Well, we shall see. Coming back to others who are commenting about the disastrous situation, I noticed that Yuri Butuzov, the Ukrainian blogger, very stern commentator, by the way, often an important and effective reporter of information about the war, he is complaining that the defense lines, the fortified lines that Ukraine was building in Kharkiv region, were built in the wrong places. And he does say that now Ukraine is finally building defensive lines in more tactically advantageous positions. But the main battles are taking place where positions were not equipped. Now, if that is true, I find that absolutely incomprehensible, because if you look at the map, if you look at where Belgorod is, if you look at where Budanov launched his incursions into Belgorod region, the places where the Russians are currently conducting their present offensive are exactly where you would expect them to go. So if the Ukrainians didn't fortify this precise area, then I really do not understand what they were doing and what they were thinking. Anyway, in my program yesterday, I mentioned that there's now open feuding between Budanov and General Syrskyi, the military commander of the Ukrainian military. Syrskyi and Budanov have apparently separately gone to Kharkiv to try, each in their own ways, to try to stabilize the situation. I mentioned in my program yesterday that the kind of reinforcements that the Ukrainians seem to be rushing to Kharkiv appear to be cobbled together reinforcements made up of a Frankenstein motley of battalions, each drawn from different brigades across the front lines. And as somebody who's had managerial experience, I cannot understand or cannot see how that can work, how it's possible to sort out a proper defense line or put together significant forces to hold back the Russians, pulling together troops in a hurry from separate units, troops who will not have trained together and who probably do not have clear command and control structures to work within. Well, as always happens, I then got a most interesting email, which I then followed up, from a member of the Duran community who pointed out that in the Second World War, the German army did have a habit of doing exactly this, creating what he called Kampfergruppe. These were units amalgamated from bits of other units, and that this sometimes actually worked surprisingly well. But the same person doubted that it would work as well for the Ukrainians because, as he pointed out, Ukraine now has a fundamental problem of a shortage of good officers and non-commissioned officers, aggressive attrition having eliminated most of the good officers, or many of the good officers and non-commissioned officers it started the war with. And in the absence of solid officers and NCOs, it's difficult to see how an attempt to recreate the Kampfergruppe concept could remotely succeed. Well, I am not going to explore this topic further. I doubt that I have the skill, but I'll be very interested to see whether anybody has anything further to say about it. And of course, time anyway will show how effective or not these hurriedly redeployed reserves are going to be. For the record, for the moment, it looks as if the Russians are advancing with minimal losses and against disorganized and weak resistance. They still seem to be capturing villages without the Ukrainians putting up much of a resistance before they do so. They still seem to be successful in gaining territory. For example, two villages, just to give their names, Bugruvatka and Lukyantsy, have either been fully captured by the Russians or are apparently on the brink of being captured by the Russians. So far, it does seem as if Ukrainian defenses in this area are not functioning effectively. Well, we shall see what happens, whether the Ukrainians are able to stabilize the situation. Though in the absence of reserves, it's going to be difficult. And of course, if the Russians start a new advance in the Sumy area, then as I said, the problems are going to compound. They're going to start getting much worse. Anyway, even as the situation in Kharkiv region deteriorates, we're now also getting reports that the events in Kharkiv region are starting to have an effect on Ukrainian resistance and defenses in other places. Now, yesterday, you may recall that I mentioned that there is a road that goes directly from Vovchansk to Kupiansk, further south. Kupiansk has been the town which briefly in 2022 became the administrative center of the Russian-controlled part of Kharkiv region. The Russians withdrew from it over the course of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive. The Ukrainians recaptured Kupiansk along with Izium, Balakleya, Belogorovka in Lugansk region, and Liman in Donetsk region, before their offensive finally came to a stop before the two Russian-controlled towns of Kremenaya and Svatovo. The Russians have advanced over the course of the late summer and autumn of 2023, right up to the outskirts of Kupiansk. Apparently, their troops can see it through binoculars. They've been engaged in sporadic clashes in the village of Sinkovka, which is immediately to the east of Kupiansk ever since. And recently, further south of Kupiansk, they've been capturing a string of villages, Tobayevka some months ago, then more recently Kislovka and Katlerovka, and others apparently, Krakhmalina. And anyway, they have been strengthening their positions in the Kupiansk area and close to the Oskol River, though so far they've shown no particular intention to attack Kupiansk itself, which, it must be said, has been a surprise to many people, including, for a time, myself. Anyway, today, Viktor Volodatsky, coordinator for interparliamentary ties with the parliaments of the Lugansk People's Republic and the Russian State Duma, in other words, a Russian official, tells us that the Ukrainians appear to be withdrawing some of their troops from Kupiansk and that only a covering force remains in the town. And this is what he says: we see from reports that 2 to 3 settlements in the Kharkiv region are liberated almost every day. There is already no military in Kupiansk, and Ukrainian commanders have long fled it. Local authorities have also left, and only covering units have remained, waiting for the approach of Russian troops. And he went on to say that the combat situation in Kupiansk will be tense, and he says that units from Western countries, regular troops from Poland and the Czech Republic have been added there under the flag of mercenaries who are today undergoing practical adaptation of unit cohesion in real battlefield conditions, as they say. And he then goes on to make some interesting observations about the general situation further north in Kharkiv region, which doesn't add anything, as far as I can see, to what I've already said. Now, I wonder whether he's right, whether indeed the situation further north in Kharkiv region, in Vovchansk and Lipsy, is now seen by the Ukrainians as so dangerous that they have indeed withdrawn their main forces from Kupiansk. He does seem to contradict himself. Volodyatsky does, by saying that there are now mercenaries, Czech and Polish mercenaries, regular troops rather, masquerading as mercenaries, taking their place in Kupiansk. Who knows? But he nonetheless is saying, or appears to be saying, that the main Ukrainian forces have now withdrawn from Kupiansk. If that is correct, then presumably the Russians are intending to attack and occupy Kupiansk before very long. And if they do launch an attack towards Kupiansk and capture that place, well, it will begin, or rather it will take further the already existing process of unraveling the entire gains of Ukraine's autumn 2022 autumn offensive, Kharkiv offensive. And of course, if Kupiansk falls back under Russian control, then conceivably the Russians could move on and advance towards Izium and Balakleya and recapture those places again. Anyway, we will see. But anyway, that is what one Russian official, Volodyatsky, has told us about the situation in Kupiansk. We don't know whether it's true. He may not know what he's saying, but he does seem to have information from official Russian sources. He is, after all, an important official coordinating the work of the Lugansk and the Lugansk regional government and the Duma. So probably he does have information which is reliable. Anyway, elsewhere, the situation for the Ukrainians is deteriorating as well. And again, it's undoubtedly connected to the operational crisis in Kharkiv. As I said, the more troops they have to redeploy from the front lines, exhausted and troops who must feel, by the way, also demoralized at being sent from one part of the front to another, treated as some kind of a fire brigade operation. But anyway, we're also now getting further news from Chasov Yar, and it's perhaps premature to say that the major Russian assault on Chasov Yar has begun, but certainly the Russians are now becoming a lot more active in Chasov Yar than they have recently been. They've obviously been shelling and bombing and drone attacking Chasov Yar for some time, and as I've said, for some time also, they seem to have encircled the micro-district to the east of the canal. Anyway, we now have pictures of Russian turtle tanks, or at least one specific Russian turtle tank, operating inside the micro-district. Ukrainians launching various drones and rocket-propelled grenades at the turtle tank, but it is too well shielded to be really significantly damaged. And these turtle tanks are also apparently stuffed with jammers, which are effective in jamming Ukrainian drones. So anyway, the Russians are definitely fighting inside the micro-district. This has been disputed and argued about for some time, but I don't think there's any real doubt about this. There are a large number of Ukrainian troops effectively trapped in the micro-district. There is no way that they can retreat now. And it's likely, therefore, that the fighting will be bitter unless and until these Ukrainian troops in the micro-district, some of whom come from elite units, including the Kraken Special Forces unit. Anyway, it's likely that unless these troops lay down their arms, which given, as I said, that they tend to be elite troops again, perhaps is unlikely. But it seems that even as the Russians are attacking and have broken into the micro district, they're also now definitely west of the canal. They appear to have advanced along a railway line, which presumably means over a bridge, or more properly, a place where the canal goes underground through a tunnel. Anyway, they seem to have advanced along a railway line, and it seems as if they're now well advanced, well past the canal in the northern part of Chasov Yar as well. And this is disputed. In fact, the Ukrainians have been claiming over the last couple of days that they actually carried out a successful counterattack in precisely this area where the Russians are supposed to be advancing along the railway line. Again, I think myself that that is very unlikely. But anyway, we'll see whether that is correct. But what is undisputed is that the Russians have now significantly expanded their control of the canal area south of Chasov Yar. They're fully entrenched on the east bank of the canal, and they now have several crossing points where the canal goes underground. They have several crossing points that they can use, and with Ukrainian forces now having been withdrawn, or some of them withdrawn from Chasov Yar to try to hold positions in Kharkiv region, it seems to me again logical that the Russians will take advantage of this and will cross the canal fairly soon. Now, bear in mind what Budanov said to the New York Times. He said that the bulk of the Ukrainian forces are now located in Chasov Yar and in Kharkiv region. All of our forces are either here in Kharkiv or in Chasov Yar. We've used everything we have. We don't have anything else in the reserves. So if there's a collapse in Chasov Yar at some point over the course of the next few weeks, and if Ukraine loses large numbers of men there, it has no reserves to plug the gaps, and the Russians would presumably quickly capture the town of Konstantinovka, which is on low ground southwest of Chasov Yar, and the way would be open to Kramatorsk and to the Dnieper River. Also, the Ukrainians themselves have been telling us over the last few weeks, up to the point where General Pavlyuk, the ground forces commander, suddenly said that Chasov Yar has no strategic significance at precisely the moment when, as I said, it seemed to me likely that the Ukrainians themselves recognize that the town is fairly soon going to fall. So anyway, another crisis starting to develop in the Chasov Yar area. We will see. And before long, I suspect we're going to start getting further news from the central Donbass area near where the Russians have already broken through in Ocheretino and Avdiivka. And, well, we're getting an awful lot less news. We have been getting an awful lot less news about the situation recently in this area because, of course, all the attention has switched to the crisis in Kharkiv. But I understand that the Russians are still advancing There are reports that they're building up their forces in Ocheretino itself, and they're moving troops towards Ocheretino up the railway line, and that they appear to be preparing major attacks on the two villages of Novo Alexandrovka, which is to the northwest of Ocheretino, and towards Kalinova, which lies to the northeast of Ocheretino, north of Arkhangelskoye, which the Russians captured about a week ago. And of course, if Kalinova falls, that puts the Russians in a position where they can start advancing towards the three villages east of the H20 highway: Sukhabalka, Valentinovka, Pantelimonivka, and by the way, it's another one, Oleksandropol, threatening Ukrainian positions in New York and Toretsk with encirclement. So, a big crisis there. Now, we've heard less from what's going on in Krasnogorovka. The last information I had, which I believe is correct, is that the Russians control all of Krasnogorovka, apart from an area to the northwest of this town. The Russians have not so far apparently attempted to advance and clear the Ukrainian troops from the northwest of Krasnogorovka. And apparently it could be that the reason for this is that they're clearing the fields to the north of Krasnogorovka. Russian troops appear to be advancing southwards from Pervomaisky. And I get the sense anyway that the priority may be to cut the roads from Krasnogorovka to Kurakovo, perhaps forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from Krasnogorovka before the roads are cut. But I think that the Russians are already looking beyond the battle of Krasnogorovka. The next battle, the key battle that is coming, is going to be the battle for Kurakovo, which is another town that the Russians want to capture to the southwest of Avdiivka. Once they've captured Kurakovo, all the main supply lines to Vuhledar in the south are cut off, and the whole Ukrainian defense position in southern Donbass will crash. But anyway, putting aside, the checkerboard quality of this battle of Donbass, which still continues, one sees how the Russians take one position and then that leads them to attack another position with control of the supply lines and the roads and the railway lines being absolutely critical to the Russian strategy. As the Russians advance, but do so in a way that seeks to conserve their forces. Anyway, even as this pattern of the fighting in Donbass is continuing, the big story for me today is the admission by Budanov that the Ukrainians are out of reserves, that they have no further reserves to deploy, and just what's happening in Kharkiv is a crisis, clearly. The Ukrainians so far have failed to stabilize the situation, and they might find, as I said before long, that they have a further crisis on their hands in Sumy region as well. But it looks as if they could be facing, before long, an absolutely critical situation if the Russians choose to take advantage now of Ukraine's difficulties by advancing on Kupiansk and Chasov Yar. In the case of Kupiansk, with possibly the imminent fall of Vovchansk, the supply lines to Kupiansk risk becoming interrupted. And we've learnt from a Russian official, Mr. Volodatsky, that the Ukrainians might be pulling out of Kupiansk. He may be wrong. And we also are getting news that the battle, the serious battle, the storming of Chasov Yar itself might perhaps be only a day or a week away. The main battle for Chasov Yar looks like it's about to begin, even as the Ukrainians themselves pull out from it. So there we go. A major operational crisis, and the Ukrainians are out of reserves. Budanov also told the New York Times that the Ukrainians are not only outgunned now, but they're outnumbered as well. And I think that this is true. And it's probably the first time this has been true since the start of the war in 2022. So, a major crisis. Well, perhaps because there is such a crisis underway, Kiev is now in the process of receiving an important visitor. And this is Secretary of State Tony Blinken. He is now going to Kiev. I don't know, maybe this was a journey that had been planned over a long time. But to be frank, I don't think so. I think, to me, it looks like he's rushing to Kiev to find out what the true situation in Ukraine is. The US obviously is aware of the infighting between Budanov and Syrskyi. It looks as if the two are not only at odds with each other, but that they're fighting separate wars. It's been suggested by people at the Military Summary Channel, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, that Budanov is trying to run things in Vovchansk, and Syrskyi is trying to run things in Lipsy. If that's correct, then all I can say is that the Ukrainian command system has completely broken down, with Budanov no longer apparently paying any attention to what Syrskyi is doing, which would be a disaster. But anyway, Blinken presumably is keen to find out what's going on. He probably is also alarmed about the increasingly moody and depressed commentary that is coming from Zelensky himself. And it's likely also that Blinken is worried about the stability of Zelensky's own position in Kiev. Today is the 14th of May. On the 21st of May, in a week's time, Zelensky's constitutional term ends. There have been criticisms of Zelensky by all sorts of Ukrainian officials or former officials. Former President Poroshenko is obviously trying to find some way of displacing Zelensky and reinstalling himself as Ukraine's president. Vitaly Klitschko, the a mayor of Kiev, former titular leader of the Maidan movement in 2013 and 2014, as I well remember, pushed aside by Victoria Nuland, who made it very clear in her notorious telephone call with the US ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, the call that was overheard and leaked by the Russians. Anyway, Victoria Nuland made it clear at the time that she did not trust Klitschko and did not want him to exercise an executive position in Ukraine's government. So that's why he was shuttled aside and made mayor of Kiev instead. Anyway, Klitschko also deeply suspicious and critical, increasingly and openly critical of Zelensky, and with his catalogue of disaster piling up, Blinken presumably is going to Kiev to try to find out what exactly is going on and whether the situation can be stabilized in some way. Now, those of us who have long memories can remember exactly the same kind of trips by senior US officials when the situation in Vietnam, for example, in the 1960s, would take a critical turn. A top official from the United States government used to rush to Saigon to find out what was going on and to see if the situation could be stabilized, and would then return to Washington and would provide the president and his officials with a report about the situation. The same happened in Baghdad, and the same happened, of course, in Kabul. In all of these places, you would get these rushed visits by US officials when it looked as if the situation was deteriorating, which it visibly is. Well, it's not clear to me what exactly it is that Blinken or any other US official at this particular time can do. Budanov is again complaining, and Zelensky routinely complains, that not enough equipment is arriving in Ukraine from the West. And we have seen all kinds of commentaries appearing in the American media, especially, that the appropriations package voted by Congress a couple of weeks ago in a storm of controversy, and unpopular, by the way, with the American people, who have been asking questions about why the money is being spent in Ukraine and not closer to home, on the border, for example. Anyway, the point about the package was that it was supposed to keep Ukraine, hold Ukraine together until the end of the year. That is beyond the November election. And of course, we've been told, and there's been article after article about this, that it's assumed, I don't know why this assumption exists, by the way, but it's assumed that if Ukraine can somehow hold together by the end of 2024, then there was going to be this huge ramp up of arms production in the United States and in Europe, and that will somehow transform Ukraine's prospects in 2025. I see absolutely no sign of such a ramp up in arms production taking place. Brian Beletic has, on the New Atlas, done an outstanding program discussing a new CSIS report about Russia's production, military production, and how that has boomed. But I see no sign that anything analogous is happening in the West. No, I don't think there's any real prospect that we're going to see a huge rush of new deliveries in 2025. Again, moreover, as Senator J.D. Vance has pointed out, the Ukrainians themselves say that they need a minimum of 4.2 million shells, 155 millimeter shells, to stabilize the situation. And there is no prospect of them getting anything like that at any particular time, because even the most optimistic figures for combined US and European production do not come anywhere remotely close to reaching that sort of figure. So I don't see what Blinken is going to come with. He will come up with another arms package, but the Ukrainians almost certainly are going to be disappointed with it. Olaf Scholz in Germany has said that Germany is going to supply Ukraine with another Patriot missile system. He was very unhappy about doing it. He said that Germany is now itself becoming increasingly short of air defense systems, but he's going to nonetheless he's agreed reluctantly to supply another, the third Patriot air defense system that Germany is going to supply to Ukraine. The Bundeswehr, the German military, which is supposed to be getting stronger, is actually getting weaker, as various German officers are apparently quietly warning, as the German military is being stripped of its weapons. There's talk of reintroducing conscription into Germany, something that was ended just a few years ago, but apparently it's going to be brought back to meet with this threat. But of course, conscription, I don't know how popular that would be in Germany, by the way, but anyway, bringing back conscription is all very well, but if all Germany's military equipment is being shipped to Ukraine and the German military is being denuded of its weapons, then that's not going to help the situation very much. And I would add, by the way, and for the record, that if Germany really is thinking of reintroducing conscription, then any idea of sending German troops to fight in Ukraine, even before conscription has been reintroduced, is going to invite huge opposition in Germany. Young Germans, whatever their feelings about Russia and the conflict, will not want to fight the Russians in Ukraine, and nor will their families. Of that, I am absolutely sure. And of course, Denmark is now saying that within a few weeks, Ukraine will be getting its F-16 fighters. We've been hearing that story, by the way, for a long time. There's been those reports about the F-16s arriving in Ukraine in June, but nobody really believes that the F-16s are going to change the situation. And, well, Prime Minister Sunak of Britain has also made a speech talking about the situation. The British recently announced a big military package for Ukraine. But again, when you actually look at the details, one senses that principally what are being supplied, along with a few more Storm Shadows. By the way, I said that there'd been a long hiatus in the use of Storm Shadows. I hadn't noticed them being used at all in the conflict zone for some time. Yesterday, we saw them return. The Russians claimed that they shot down 4. And again, no reports that any particular damage was done in consequence. But anyway, the British Prime Minister Sunak announcing this weapons package. He's now made a speech. This was a long, wide-ranging speech covering all sorts of issues, attempting, I think, to give some coherence to a conservative government that has long lost it. But that's another story. But anyway, he made 2 observations. One was that he blamed the Russians for cutting off gas to Europe, which, again, Olaf Scholz has been saying that for some time. The British are now, Sunak is now also saying it. I mean, it's an assertion that is so obviously untrue that it just takes my breath away. That people can come along, political leaders, prime ministers of important European countries, can come forward and make statements like that. As I said, it just... Anyway, I'm not going to say more. But the other thing that Sunak did, which I found most interesting, is that he said that the situation is more dangerous now than it has ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, he said that this is entirely due to President Putin's actions. Now, of course, he did not mention or discuss Foreign Secretary Cameron's statement about the Ukrainians being at liberty to launch missile strikes at Russia itself using British missiles, nor did he really discuss the fact that that statement provoked the Russians to call in the British ambassador and to give the British a warning that if missile strikes ever did take place against Russia in that kind of way, the Russians would feel themselves at liberty and might launch missile strikes in response at British military targets anywhere in the world, including by implication against Britain itself. But when Sunak refers to the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can see that this is what he is thinking about. He must be concerned about this Russian threat. And anyway, we can see that the British are putting on a brave face, but deep down, they understand how dangerous and difficult the situation has become. By the way, the Russian ambassador has recently been apparently in an open debate with a British MP, Mr. Burgeon, and apparently there was a rather testy exchange in which the Russian ambassador made it absolutely clear to the British that the Russians are fully aware that the British are playing a role in programming and targeting missiles, the missiles that they supply to Ukraine, the Storm Shadows, and that the Russians are not fooled about it. I haven't seen the film or read the transcript of this exchange, but I have heard about it. Anyway, the point I'm making is that we have all of these brave words coming out of Europe, Patriot missile deliveries from Germany, words, as I discussed yesterday, by President Macron, visits by Tony Blinken. But realistically, there just doesn't seem to be very much that the West at this point in time can do. The proposal that was made a couple of days ago by some German MPs that the Germans and the Europeans establish a no-fly zone of around 70 kilometers on Ukraine's western border by installing air defense missiles in Romania and Poland, something which, by the way, the Romanians and the Poles, so far as I know, have not so far commented about, and which I'm also told would be contrary to Romanian law, just saying. But anyway, that proposal, which, as I said, would undoubtedly invite Russian retaliation against those missile bases, those air defense missile bases. Anyway, that proposal has been apparently shot down, not just by Chancellor Scholz, but by the entire the parliamentary faction of the Social Democratic Party, which is the biggest party in Chancellor Scholz's coalition. They pointed out that this would be direct involvement by Germany in the war, and they say that that possibility is categorically ruled out. So, lots of plans, lots of schemes, lots of brave words, but ultimately not anywhere near enough weapons to send to Ukraine, and Ukraine desperately short of men, and Budanov himself saying that they're out of reserves. Contrast that with the situation of the Russians, who have vast numbers of weapons and who have huge reserves. As we see signs of uncertainty and panic and chaos in Ukraine, and uncertainty and panic and chaos in the Western countries as they survey the situation in Ukraine, well, the other side, if I can call them that, the Russians and the Chinese are preparing to talk to each other. The dates for Putin's visit to Beijing have now been confirmed. He will be in China on the 16th and 17th of May, a 2-day visit, and it's likely that he's going to leave Moscow for China tomorrow. So, an important visit with probably a strong delegation in tow. Lavrov will probably participate in it, and the Kremlin is telling us that they're going to have Putin and Xi are going to discuss their strategic partnership, and that they're going to sign documents with each other. In fact, this is how TASS reports it. According to the Russian Presidential Press Service, the two leaders will discuss in detail the entire set of comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction issues. They will determine the key directions of the further development of Russian-Chinese practical cooperation and exchange opinions on the most pressing international issues. And the Kremlin has noted that it is planned to sign a joint statement of the heads of state following talks and a number of bilateral documents. And Lavrov will be accompanying Putin, so I understand, and so will Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, who has now been reappointed a senior aide to President Putin. He's just been reappointed to that post, senior foreign policy aide to President Putin. Meanwhile, even as Putin prepares to travel to Beijing, the government reshuffle in Moscow has been completed. And firstly, we now have confirmation that Nikolai Patrushev, the outgoing secretary of the Security Council, replaced in that position by Sergei Shoigu, the former defense minister. Anyway, Nikolai Patrushev has now also been appointed a senior aide to Putin, and he has apparently been given the task of supervising the work of the shipbuilding industry. Now, that may sound a little surprising, but actually Patrushev's background, his original training and education is as a shipbuilding engineer. That is what he qualified as from an institute that he studied in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it now is. In fact, the institute which Patrushev attended all those years ago is Russia's leading institute in shipbuilding and ship design and construction. So this is obviously for the civilian industry. Now, again, that may sound a little bit strange, but the Russians have a huge plan to massively expand their merchant fleet. If the sanctions have taught them anything, it is that they are not safe relying on foreign carriers to ship their cargoes. They have anyway been busy building a huge new shipbuilding facility in the Far East, There are some speculations, by the way, that they might eventually build aircraft carriers there. It's big enough to do it. But anyway, the priority clearly is to build up the shipbuilding industry, and that is what Patrushev is going to be supervising. It's not a small matter, but it means that he remains a member of Putin's team with direct access to Putin himself. Shipbuilding is a strategic industry, or seen as such, in Russia. And by the way, and for the record, there's been lots of complaints recently in the United States that because the shipbuilding industry in the United States has contracted to disastrous levels, the United States is now finding it impossible to compete with China in naval ship construction. China apparently now accounts for around half the shipbuilding capacity in the world. So obviously the Russians are not going to achieve Chinese levels of production. They have no need for that. But they will start building ships, and the naval race between the United States and China shows that this is a strategic industry, and Russia's own needs as a major exporter of oil and energy products and food and raw materials, and before long, as they hope, of finished goods as well, manufactured goods as well, as a major exporter and, by the way, importer. The Russians have come to understand the importance of having a large merchant marine, which, by the way, they did during the Soviet era, as I very well remember. At that time, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the Soviet merchant marine was one of the biggest in the world. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. So that's what Patrushev is doing. Perhaps even more interesting is that Putin has now appointed a man called Alexei Dumin as his presidential aide. Now, Dumin is a most interesting person, and one of these people with a very complex and somewhat mysterious biography. When I say mysterious, there are gaps in it which it is universally believed indicate that he has worked in the intelligence services, the Russian intelligence services, doing various things. Anyway, Dumin has been something of a rising star in the Russian political system for some time. And as I said, there's been a lot of discussion about him, and some discussion that he might eventually be the person who could conceivably succeed Putin himself. Now, I've always somewhat cast doubt on that. I've said that his current post, or his current post until now, which is governor of Tula region. This is a industrial region close to Moscow, a major center of the Russian military industrial complex, and, by the way, a major artillery foundry going all the way back to the 18th century, I believe to the era of Peter the Great. Anyway, whilst that is obviously a very strategic position, being governor of this key industrial and arms manufacturing city, it was not the sort of position that one would expect of someone who was about to become, who would one day become president of Russia. And I've said that if Dumin, who is, by the way, 51, relatively young, were appointed to a position in the Kremlin, that's the point when one would need to start taking seriously his prospects, his possible prospects as a potential successor to Putin? Well, he's now been appointed to a position in the Kremlin. He's just been made an aide to Putin in the Kremlin, and we're told that he will oversee issues of the defense industry, the state council, and will supervise sports in the presidential administration. Now, those who remember the old days of the Soviet Union will recall that in those days, the government was led, in effect, by the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The key institution, the key administrative institution, was the Secretariat of the Central Committee, which the General Secretary headed. Of course, the deliberative body was the Politburo, and I discussed in my program yesterday how the deliberative body today, the decision-making body today, is the Security Council. But the executive body, the key executive body, was the Central Committee Secretariat. And today, it is, of course, the Executive Office. The Executive Office is headed by Putin himself. He is the president. He is not fulfilling the role of a Soviet General Secretary, but he has absorbed some of the roles which once upon a time a General Secretary used to fill. And of course, as the president, the Executive Office is directly answerable to him. And just as the General Secretary had subordinate secretaries responsible to him in the Secretariat, so does Putin have aides who run departments within the Executive Office, the Secretariat, in other words, of the Presidential Secretariat. And the people, amongst these people, we now have Patrushev himself, who's going to be an aide, what would once in Soviet times have been called a secretary of the Central Committee. And we now have Dumin fulfilling the same role. So we have Dumin, who is in overall charge, supervising the work of the defense industries, keeping an eye on what Shoigu is doing, reporting also to Putin, keeping an eye on Shoigu from within the Executive Office responsible to Putin himself. We have Patrushev with overall responsibility for shipbuilding, again, occupying the same position that a former Central Committee secretary, given this role, might have had in the inner secretariat. And we have others. Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, runs the foreign section of the Executive Office. And other aides include people like Medinsky, who runs cultural issues, supervises cultural issues, and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that Putin and the team around him have deliberately recreated the same kind of structures that the Soviet Union had at the center of power. What I'm saying is that Russia has its own bureaucratic and executive culture, and it is perhaps not surprising that despite the changes in regime, the overall contours of the structure tend to reproduce themselves. So we have Dumin Patrushev appointed to these very important positions. It will also be interesting to see, by the way, whether Patrushev retains his position as a member of the Security Council. If he does, that will show that he is a very powerful person indeed. And in the meantime, we have Shoigu himself, the former defense minister, the direct hands-on supervision of the military-industrial complex, and working as Security Council Secretary, a position which puts him, by the way, in overall charge of Russia's various intelligence and security agencies. So he will be reporting regularly to Putin on the kind of work that the intelligence and security agencies are also doing. So, an interesting rearrangement of the structure in Moscow. Now, Peskov, that's to say Putin's spokesman, has also clarified more things about Shoigu's position. He has said that it is wrong to see Shoigu's appointment as Security Council Secretary as a demotion. And these are his words. I don't think it is appropriate to put the question this way. This is a very high state post with a very wide range of tasks, playing a huge role for the whole country. Of course, the head of this body is constantly in direct contact with the head of state and bears great responsibility. So this is clearly intended to answer those claims that Shoigu has been demoted in some way. What is true is that the purge of corrupt officials, or supposedly allegedly corrupt officials, within the defense ministry is continuing. Now, we've had about a week ago, confirmation that Timur Ivanov, one of the deputy defense ministers, had been arrested, and he was apparently in charge of logistical matters. He'd been arrested on corruption charges. And yesterday we got news that another deputy defense minister, Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov, has been arrested as well. Now, Kuznetsov, at the time of his arrest, in other words, the day before yesterday, headed the main personnel directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, that is presumably responsible for assigning top military officers to particular commands, though the ultimate decision as to which officer commands what position will be made by the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, and Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has gone out of his way to make clear that Gerasimov remains in post. But before Kuznetsov apparently held this position, he apparently held until 2023 an even more sensitive position, the 8th Directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. In other words, he was an official of the Russian General Staff, a senior official in the Russian General Staff. And we're told that Lieutenant General Kuznetsov was detained as a suspect in a criminal offense. The case is being investigated by the main military investigation department of the Russian investigative committee. Now, it gets more interesting because we have had some more details about the case that's being brought against Kuznetsov, and we're told that the bribes that he was receiving, which were apparently on a very large scale, he started receiving them in 2021, and they continued until 2023. In other words, he appears to have been receiving these bribes whilst he was a member of the Russian General Staff. And it's been suggested that the payment, or it's been alleged that the payments, which are, as I said, very large, were being paid to him by some kind of commercial organization. Now, I wonder whether in Kuznetsov's case, there isn't a suspicion that he was passing secrets, and that he was in fact, that this isn't in fact some kind of an espionage case. I'm just saying. Anyway, we will find out more in due course as these cases, the ones against Ivanov and the one against Kuznetsov proceed. But one way or the other, as I said, a major reshuffle in Moscow of the security posts. Belousov has now apparently been confirmed as defense minister by the upper house of Russia's parliament, the Federation Council. He's already made comments about the importance of ensuring that the members of the armed forces get the financial and other benefits that they're entitled to. And he seems to be saying that that is going to be one of his priorities. And importantly, he's also made clear that in terms of the command arrangements for the special military operation, these are going to remain unchanged. Now, as I went to great pains to explain yesterday, Shoigu, like Belousov, is a civilian. But it's probably true to say that Shoigu, even before he became defense minister, would have had closer contact with the military whilst he was emergencies minister than Belousov has done. And one does get the impression that Shoigu played a more hands-on role in military decision-making. I remember that it was he, for example, who specifically recommended Gerasimov to Putin as Chief of General Staff, and gave the impression that he already knew Gerasimov quite well on the occasion of his appointment. I suspect that Belousov's contacts with the military, though certainly not non-existent, are on a lesser level than Shoigu's. And that inevitably means that within the structure of the defense ministry, at least for the time being, the Chief of General Staff, Gerasimov, is going to play an even bigger role. So those who see these events as signaling a weakening in Gerasimov's position, at least for the time being, are certainly wrong. Not only is Gerasimov still in charge of the special military operation, but as Chief of General Staff, he is now the senior military officer, the senior military man, the head of the entire military, in effect, in Russia, and to the extent that Shoigu was his superior in that role before, it is unlikely that Belousov will be, or indeed even wants to be. So anyway, that's the reshuffle in Moscow. As I said, Putin on his way to Beijing. A relatively short stay, 2 days, but we will see what comes of it. I'm getting more reports, by the way, about the meeting between Macron and Xi Jinping. I've recently been provided with a very helpful article by a Chinese academic describing a speech that he gave to an audience in France. And this Chinese academic revealed one interesting fact, that apparently Macron initially wanted the meeting with Xi Jinping also to include Olaf Scholz, but Olaf Scholz refused to come. It's clear that relations between Macron and Scholz are very bad at the moment, and it seems that there is anyway a difference in perspective about policy towards China between Macron and Scholz. Scholz apparently still wants to maintain a good relationship, or at least a steady relationship with China. He opposes Macron's attempts to impose restrictions on imports of Chinese EV cars into Europe, because Scholz worries that the Chinese might in that case retaliate against German car imports into China, which are absolutely vital for the German motor vehicle economy. Anyway, an unsuccessful meeting there, and this comment by the Chinese academic said as much. But it will be very interesting to see what Putin and Xi talk about and what they discuss with each other. But that is going to be the topic of future programs. Putin, of course, is not yet in China. We will see what happens when he is there. And this is where I end my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.